Iran is one of the most invaded places in human history. Empires have marched into this land for over 5,000 years, burning cities, toppling kingdoms, and trying to erase what came before. But every empire that tried to destroy Iran made the same mistake. They thought winning the war meant winning the land. But Iran was never just land, and that's why, even after thousands of years of invasion, it's still here. Few places on Earth have been invaded this many times and still preserved their language, memory, and identity. To reach it, armies had to cross deserts, climb mountains, stretch fragile supply lines. This is not just the history of Iran. It is the story of why empires kept entering this land and why none of them could erase it. Before the word Iran ever existed, this land was already fighting for survival. To the west lay Mesopotamia, flat, open, easy to invade. Armies could move quickly, cities could be surrounded, empires could rise and fall in a single generation. But just beyond those plains, everything changed. The land rose, mountains stretched across the horizon, forming what would become one of the most important natural defenses in history, the Zagros Mountains. And for the next 5,000 years, every empire that marched east would learn the same lesson. Invading this land was not a campaign, it was a deadly trap. By around 3000 BC, a civilization had already taken root inside this fortress, the Elamites. Centered around the city of Susa, they were not a wandering tribe or a short-lived kingdom. They were something far more dangerous. They belonged to the land. While the great powers of Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon fought endless wars on open ground, the Elamites watched from the highlands. More than once, the Elamites marched into Mesopotamia and did the unthinkable. They sacked Babylon, one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, reduced to chaos. Not once, but multiple times. This was the first warning. Iran was not just a place you could conquer. It was a place that could reach out and break you first. For nearly 2,000 years, Elam remained a major power. But like every empire before and after, it eventually faced something stronger. From the west came the Assyrians. Relentless, brutal, unstoppable. They didn't just defeat their enemies, they erased them. Cities burned, people enslaved, entire cultures wiped from history. And when they turned toward Elam, it seemed like this would be the end. In 646 BC, the Assyrians destroyed Susa. The great Elamite cities fell, their power collapsed. And for a moment, it looked like the pattern had been broken, that the land had finally lost. But what the Assyrians didn't realize was that they hadn't conquered Iran. They had only cleared the stage. Because deeper in the mountains, new powers were already rising, watching, learning, waiting. Among those rising in the shadows of the mountains were the Medes. At first, they were not an empire. They were tribes, scattered, divided, living in a land that was difficult to control, but even harder to unify. And to the west, something far more powerful was watching: the Assyrian Empire. At its peak, Assyria was the most feared war machine the world had ever seen. They did not just conquer cities, they erased them. Their message was simple: submit or disappear. And for years, the Medes had no choice but to endure it. They were raided, punished, hunted, every rebellion crushed, every attempt at unity broken. This wasn't war, this was survival. But something began to change, because the Medes were not just resisting, they were learning. They studied Assyrian warfare, their tactics, their brutality, their discipline, and slowly, the scattered tribes began to unite. What had once been weakness became strength. Because in the mountains, control was never easy, and now neither was conquest. By the 7th century BC, the Medes were no longer just tribes. They had become a kingdom, organized, armed, and ready, but they did not rise alone. To the south, another power was growing: Babylon. Once a victim of Assyrian domination, now hungry for revenge. And for the first time, Assyria faced something it had never faced before. An enemy that had learned from it. and was now coming back. In 612 BC, the Medes and Babylonians marched together toward the heart of Assyria. Their target, Nineveh, the capital, the symbol, the center of power. What followed was not just a battle. It was the collapse of a system built on fear. The city was besieged, breached, burned. The empire that once terrified the world was reduced to ruins. Assyria fell, and with it, one of the greatest war machines in history disappeared. But this victory meant something deeper, because for the first time, an empire had marched into the Iranian world and failed to break it. This was the moment the pattern became clear. Invading this land did not just create enemies, it created survivors, and survivors became empires. But even as the Medes stood victorious, their power would not last, because to the south, a new force was rising and built something the world had never seen before. His name was Cyrus. At the time, he was not an emperor. He was a king of a small Persian state in the south. But what he was about to build would change the balance of power forever, because Cyrus understood something no one before him fully had. Winning wars was not enough. If you wanted to survive, you had to control everything that came after. In 550 BC, Cyrus turned against the Medes, the same Medes who had just destroyed Assyria, the same empire that now ruled the Iranian plateau. And in a single campaign, he defeated them, not by destroying them, but by absorbing them. This was new, because Cyrus did not just conquer enemies, he turned them into allies. And then, he kept going. West into Lydia, east into Central Asia, and finally, toward one of the greatest cities on earth, Babylon. A city that had stood for centuries, fortified, rich, untouchable, until Cyrus arrived. In 539 BC, Babylon fell, but not in flames, because Cyrus did something no conqueror had done before. He let the city live. He allowed religions to continue, traditions to survive, people to return home, even those who had been exiled, including entire nations. This wasn't weakness, it was control, because Cyrus had discovered something more powerful than fear: loyalty. And behind that control was an army unlike anything the world had seen. The Immortals, 10,000 elite soldiers. If one died, another replaced him instantly. To the enemy, it looked like they could not be defeated. An army that never shrank. But Cyrus's empire was not held together by soldiers alone. It was held together by speed. The royal road stretched over 1,600 miles. Messengers could cross it in days. Orders traveled faster than rebellion. And before enemies could organize, they were already surrounded. This was no longer just a kingdom. It was a system that could conquer, absorb, adapt, and expand. And for nearly 2 centuries, it worked. The Persian Empire became the largest the world had ever seen, stretching across continents, connecting cultures, controlling everything in between. But no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. From the west came a new threat. Young, relentless, ambitious, a man who believed he could conquer the world. Alexander of Macedon. And in less than a decade, he would bring the Persian Empire to its knees. But what Alexander didn't understand was that defeating Persia was not the same as destroying it. Alexander came fast, faster than any empire before him. In 334 BC, he crossed into Asia. Young, relentless, certain he could do what no one had done before: destroy Persia. Battle after battle, the Persian defenses broke. At Issus, at Gaugamela, the Achaemenid army, once unstoppable, collapsed under pressure. Cities fell, satraps surrendered, and in 330 BC, the unthinkable happened. Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, was burned. The empire that had ruled the known world was gone. To the outside world, it looked like Persia had finally been defeated, the greatest empire on earth, erased in less than a decade. But beneath the surface, something hadn't changed. The land was still there, the people were still there, The systems were still there, and Alexander realized it, because instead of destroying Persia, he began to copy it. He adopted Persian dress, took Persian titles, integrated Persian elites into his rule, even encouraged his own men to marry into Persian families. This was not how conquerors behaved. This was something else. Alexander had won the war, but he had stepped into something bigger than himself. Because ruling Iran was not the same as conquering it. It required becoming part of it. And the moment he died in 323 BC, everything began to fall apart. His empire shattered. Generals turned on each other. The land was divided, and Iran fell under the control of the Seleucid Empire, a Greek-ruled system stretching across former Persian lands. Cities were rebuilt, Greek culture spread, power was re-established, but it didn't last, because distance mattered, because the terrain mattered, because control from the west was never stable, and because beneath the surface, Iran was still Iran, waiting. By the 3rd century BC, control began to weaken, rebellion spread, authority fractured, and from the northeast, a new power emerged, not from great cities, but from the edges of the empire. A people who understood something critical. You don't fight empires head-on, you outlast them. They were called the Parthians. And for the next several centuries, they would turn Iran into something even more dangerous. A place where empires didn't just struggle, they stalled. They were not like the Persians. They did not build massive cities. They did not centralize power. They did not try to control everything. And that is exactly what made them dangerous. They were the Parthians. Originally nomadic, riders of the open land, masters of distance. And when they entered the Iranian plateau, they didn't try to reshape it. They adapted to it. Unlike the rigid armies of earlier empires, the Parthians fought differently. They moved fast. They struck from a distance. And when you thought you had them cornered, they disappeared, only to return when you were weakest. Their most feared tactic became legendary: the Parthian shot. Riders would retreat, drawing enemy forces forward. Then, while riding away, they would turn their bodies and fire arrows backward with deadly accuracy. To their enemies, it felt like fighting shadows. You advance, they vanished. You chase, they struck. And eventually, this brought them face to face with the most powerful empire of their time, Rome, an empire that had crushed everything in its path. Disciplined, organized, relentless, used to winning, but Iran was different. In 53 BC, a Roman general named Crassus marched east, confident, wealthy, certain of victory. He entered Parthian territory, expecting a quick campaign. Instead, he walked into a disaster. Parthian cavalry surrounded his forces. Arrows rained down, again and again and again. Crassus was killed, and his army was destroyed. For Rome, this was something new. They had faced strong enemies before, but not like this, because in Iran, you couldn't just win a battle and take control. You had to survive the land, the distance, the exhaustion, the constant pressure. For centuries, Rome and Parthia clashed. Neither side could fully defeat the other, because Iran was not a place you could easily dominate. And every time Rome pushed forward, it paid the price. Too fragmented, too difficult to control. In 224 AD, the balance shifted again. A Persian noble named Ardashir overthrew the Parthians, and in their place, a centralized empire, disciplined, organized, relentless, the Sassanian Empire. Unlike the Parthians, the Sassanians did not rely on flexibility. They built structure, a strong central authority, a unified military, a defined identity. For the first time in centuries, Iran was no longer a loose system, it was a fortress. And once again, the West came. Then later, the Byzantine Empire. Two superpowers facing each other across the same line. For over 400 years, they fought. War after war, campaign after campaign. Because every advance into Iran came at a cost. Distance stretched supply lines, mountains slowed armies, resistance never stopped. And even when victories came, they never lasted. By the 7th century, the conflict reached its peak. The final war between Byzantium and the Sassanians was devastating. Both empires pushed everything they had into one last struggle. And for a moment, it looked like Iran might finally break. But the end didn't come from the west. It came from somewhere no one expected. Muslim Arab armies moved into Sassanian territory. Battle after battle, the weakened empire collapsed, and in 651 AD, the Sassanian Empire ended. For the second time in history, it looked like Iran had been destroyed, its empire gone, its rulers gone, its system gone. But once again, the deeper structure remained, because even under Arab rule, its language survived, its culture adapted, its scholars, poets, and thinkers reshaped the very civilization that conquered it. Instead of being erased, Iran transformed the world around it. Empires had now conquered Iran twice. The Greeks, the Arabs, both had taken control, but neither had erased it. And what came next would prove this pattern even further. Because from the east, a force was coming that destroyed everything in its path. The Mongols. They came from the east, fast, silent, unstoppable. In the early 1200s, they swept across Asia like a storm. Cities fell in days. Armies collapsed in hours. Entire populations wiped out. This was not conquest. This was destruction. When they reached Iran, there was no negotiation, no slow advance, only fire. Cities that had stood for centuries were erased. Libraries burned, fields destroyed, entire regions left empty. For the first time, it truly looked like Iran might not recover. The old systems were gone. Political order collapsed. Trade networks shattered. Population numbers dropped dramatically. This wasn't just another invasion. This was near extinction. But even this did not end it, because something began to change. The Mongols didn't just rule Iran, they stayed.
If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you.
And over time, they adapted. They adopted Persian administration. They supported Persian scholars. They rebuilt cities. And eventually, many of them converted to Islam. The conquerors became part of what they conquered. This was now a pattern. Invaders entered Iran with force. They destroyed. They ruled. But over time, they changed, and Iran remained. Even after the Mongol Empire weakened, Iran did not return to immediate stability. Power fractured again. Different rulers fought for control. Then came another force from the east, Timur, a conqueror as brutal as the Mongols and just as relentless. But even this followed the same pattern. Destruction followed by absorption, collapse followed by rebuilding. By the end of the 15th century, after centuries of invasion and fragmentation, something had become clear. Iran could be conquered. It could be burned, it could be broken, again and again, but it could not be erased. And in the early 1500s, a new empire would rise that would define Iran in a way no empire before it had, the Safavids. By the early 1500s, everything changed. Not just power, identity. In 1501, a young leader named Ismail took control of Iran. Ismail made a decision that would reshape Iran permanently. He declared Twelver Shia Islam as the official religion of the state. This was not just a religious move, it was strategic, because it separated Iran from the rest of the region, especially from its greatest rival, the Ottoman Empire. To the west, the Ottomans expanded, powerful, organized, dominant, and now, for the first time in centuries, Iran faced an enemy that could match it. War became constant, battles along the border, shifting territories, endless tension. But unlike previous invasions, this was different. Under the Safavids, Iran became more unified than ever before. central authority strengthened, cities expanded, trade routes revived, and culture flourished. The capital, Isfahan, became one of the most magnificent cities in the world. Not just a center of power, but a symbol. For the first time, Iran was no longer just surviving history, it was shaping it. Because now, even when the empire weakened, the identity remained stronger than ever. By the early 1700s, Safavid power began to fall. Internal corruption, external pressure, economic strain. Once again, invasion and chaos returned. Even when Iran weakened politically, it did not lose itself. Its identity was no longer tied to one ruler or one dynasty. It had become permanent, and as the world moved into a new era, the threats changed. Russia, Britain, and soon, forces far beyond the battlefield. It was empires, global, industrial, strategic, and Iran was caught in the middle. To the north, the Russian Empire pushed south, taking territory, expanding influence. To the south, the British Empire advanced, protecting its interests in India. Two superpowers, one land between them. Unlike many regions of the world, Iran was never fully colonized, but that didn't mean it was free, because control came in a different form. Economic pressure, political interference, foreign concessions, decisions made outside the country. Territories were lost, resources were exploited, authority weakened. By the early 1900s, pressure turned into resistance. In 1906, a revolution erupted. The people demanded a constitution, a parliament, a government limited by law. But the great powers were watching. A stronger Iran was not in their interest. And for the first time in our era, the West didn't just oppose Iran. It actively sabotaged its economic and military ambitions, fearing what the nation might one day become. So once again, external forces intervened. The movement was crushed, and instability returned. In 1925, a military officer rose to power, Reza Shah. He aimed to rebuild the state, modernize the country, strengthen the military, unify the nation, and for a time, it worked. But the world was changing fast. In 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded. Reza Shah was forced to step down, and once again, foreign powers shaped the future of Iran. It was a new kind of invasion, not about land alone, but influence, power, control over resources. And once again, Iran was pushed to adapt. In 1951, a new leader rose to power, Mohammad Mossadegh. He made a bold move. He nationalized Iran's oil, taking it back from foreign control. For the first time in decades, Iran tried to reclaim its own resources. The reaction was immediate. Economic pressure, sanctions, isolation, and when that didn't work, something else followed. In 1953, a covert operation removed him from power. The Shah returned, and Iran was pushed back under external influence. For years, the country was reshaped from above. Modernization, industrial growth, military expansion. But beneath the surface, tension grew. But above all, a profound resentment over his perceived status as a Western-dependent puppet who was eroding traditional Iranian culture. The monarchy collapsed, and a new system emerged, the Islamic Republic. For the first time in modern history, Iran fully broke away from external alignment, rejecting both East and West. But independence came with a cost. Just 1 year later, in 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, expecting a quick victory, expecting collapse. Instead, they found resistance. The war lasted 8 years. Cities destroyed, lives lost, resources drained. One of the longest and most brutal conflicts of the modern era. And in the end, no clear winner. But one clear result. Iran did not fall. Sanctions followed, pressure continued. Conflicts never fully disappeared, but the pattern remained the same. External forces pushed, Iran adapted, survived, endured. From ancient empires to modern conflicts, the story never really changed. Different enemies, different weapons, different eras. But the same outcome. And that leads to the final question. After 5,000 years of war, why is Iran still here?